as long as nuclear weapons exist, the chances of survival of the human species are quite slight. I mean, there have been repeated occasions over and over again when we've come very close to nuclear war. In fact, we have declassified U.S. records. The Russian systems are obviously much worse, so whatever is true of us, it's got to be worse for them. But there are literally dozens of occasions when the nuclear weapons are on automated response systems. So if, automated systems detect something going on somewhere, the computers calculate and you get an order to fire the weapons. There are literally dozens of cases where it came up to within a couple of minutes of sending off nuclear missiles. It was aborted by human intervention. Okay, that's the U.S. side. Russian side undoubtedly is a lot worse because they don't have the systems are no good and so on. Well, that's just playing with fire. Sooner or later, there's not going to be a human intervention. Furthermore, there are explicit cases where we've come literally within instance of nuclear war. I mean, the most extreme case, which should really be studied carefully, is 1962, the missile crisis. That's been intensively investigated now. For one reason, because the people involved, like Robert McNamara and others, they recognized how crazy it was. Arthur Schlesinger, who was in the government then, called it the most dangerous moment in human history. There was actually a moment there when one Russian submarine commander prevented what could have been a nuclear war. At one point in the missile crisis, Kennedy had established an embargo of Cuba. No ships could come within a certain distance, and Russian ships were approaching that line. There were also, nobody knew it at the time, but there were Russian submarines there which had nuclear-tipped missiles. They were attacked by U.S. destroyers, depth charges, and the commanders of the submarines, who had authority to fire nuclear missiles, same as true of U.S. systems, they thought a war had started. There were 3 commanders. 2 of them decided to send off the missiles. Okay, the third, Vasily Arkhipov, who should get 20 Nobel Peace Prizes, he rejected the order, and they had to have all 3 agreeing, so they didn't fire them. I mean, if they'd fired, these are not nuclear, big, huge nuclear weapons, but if they'd fired nuclear-tipped missiles, the U.S. reaction, we know from the internal plans, was, they do something like that. We take out Moscow, they take out London, and there it goes on from that. You should read the studies that we know what they were. It came that close. Actually, there was another moment in the missile crisis which amazingly is described as one of John F. Kennedy's great achievements. I mean, in my view, it's one of the worst crimes in human history. What happened, the facts are known and not debated. At a peak moment of the missile crisis, just coming to its peak, Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy in which he offered a way to end it. The offer was that Russia would remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States would remove missiles in Turkey. Now, the missiles in Turkey are much more of a threat to Russia than the missiles in Cuba were to the United States, but that's the usual asymmetry. We're allowed to do things that others can't do. Now, Kennedy was kind of surprised when he got that letter because he had already given an order to withdraw the missiles from Turkey because they were obsolete. They were being replaced by much more destructive Polaris submarines in the Mediterranean. So he pointed out in internal discussion, this is going to be a hard offer to refuse. It's not going to sell in Peoria the way it's put. But he decided to refuse it, just to preserve the macho image and to show that we run things. So, in fact, they did withdraw the missiles from Turkey, but secretly. That was part of the process of humiliating Khrushchev. And to reach that goal, he was willing to face what he himself considered a probability of about 1/3 of nuclear war. I mean, these are what goes on. These are things that go on in the minds of, the best and the brightest, as they call themselves. Just think of the rest. Well, Kissinger, Schultz, and others have been right in the middle of this, and they know that we're on the verge of catastrophe. So they're saying, look, we got to do something to get rid of this destructive capacity. This really doesn't have to do with deterrence so much. As far as deterrence is concerned, there are interesting discussions. One of the most interesting is a very important book written by one of Israel's leading strategic analysts, a guy named Ze'ev Maoz. It's in English. I think it's called Defending the Holy Land. He goes through, it's about 1,000 pages of detailed analysis of Israel's strategic objectives since 1948. And he's very judicious. He gives the arguments on both sides. It's careful. He knows what he's talking about. His basic conclusion is that Israel's policies have been selected in ways which harm its security. Actually, that's not unusual. That's true of the policies of most states, including Britain and the United States. So if you bother to look at the Chilcot inquiry, you'll have noticed that the head of British intelligence testified that when they decided to go to war against Iraq, it was on the assumption that it would sharply increase the terrorist risk to Britain. And she points out that the CIA had the same assumption. Okay, we already sort of knew that from other sources, but this is the highest level confirmation. And that's correct, and they decided to go ahead anyway. And the reason is the security of the people of Britain and the United States is not a high priority for planners. It's a low priority. There's plenty of evidence for that. Other countries are similar. Well, in the case of Israel, that's his conclusion. When he gets to nuclear, he has a chapter on nuclear weapons, which is worth reading. And he argues, I think, pretty judiciously and convincingly that Israel's nuclear weapons program has harmed its security. Gives a good argument. And if security were the top concern, I think that argument would be taken seriously. It's a striking fact, if you look over history, that state actions are often taken with the understanding that they may very well harm security. You take a look at the history of wars. Those who started the wars very often lose them with disastrous consequences. And it's taken into account because they're higher priorities.